Reglobalization with an EU pull. The long-term research program Conflictual Deglobalization and Selective Reglobalization was launched in 2013 by the think tank Stratematica, which I coordinated and still direct, when Barack Obama introduced the project of two Americentric economic areas, one in the Pacific, TPP, and the other with the EU, TTIP, excluding China and Russia. In 2017, the first Trump administration withdrew from the TPP agreement, despite it having been signed with 11 nations, in order to retain full sovereign control over the ability to balance trade give-and-take with the region. It also supported the bipartisan Congressional declaration identifying China as a systemic rival, reversing a U.S. posture that had endured for decades. The TTIP ended up in a drawer due to European, mainly German, concerns about a symmetrical counterreaction from China and a militarized reconfiguration of Russia, already visible from 2014. The Biden administration resumed the Americanist approach adopted under Trump, but reshaped it through competitive measures aimed at attracting reindustrializing investments back to the United States, reshoring. The second Trump administration developed a coercive form of Americanism, imposing customs costs for access to the U.S. market on both allies and non-allies, while overstating the reasons for commercial imbalance toward the former. In 2025, deglobalization reached a peak, relative rather than absolute, and this pushed the EU, driven especially by Germany, which had been severely strained by the compressive pressure coming from Washington and by Chinese competitiveness, to accelerate a process of Eurocentric reglobalization. This shift was also supported by the willingness of many nations, both within the G7 and across the global south, to participate, creating the conditions for considering a new probabilistic vector in the field of economic and financial geopolitics. It is not new for allies such as Canada and Japan to shift toward the EU by signing zero-tariff trade agreements in order to compensate for difficulties with the United States. What is new is that India, traditionally highly protectionist, has done so with the EU not only on the commercial front, but also on the strategic level and in the field of the military industry. Equally unprecedented is the convergence, despite resistance from the European agricultural sector, though solvable, after decades of negotiations between the EU and Mercosur. The first assessment concerns the scale conditions under which Eurocentric reglobalization, with compensatory rules addressing the crisis of international law, could reduce Europe's dependence, particularly that of Germany and Italy, on exports to the United States. The scale analysis shows that additional economic agreements would be needed with Australia, the United Kingdom, Indonesia, the Emirates, and others in the Pacific, but above all with Africa. Indeed, both the European strategy and Italy's strategy of bilateral strategic partnerships are accelerating in this direction. Timing? Given the compensatory effect mentioned above, and factoring in the expansion of investments driven by a financial feed-forward mechanism, an initial compensatory result would be achieved fairly quickly, within about 3 years. But this calculation depends on the negative reaction of the United States and China to European expansionism. The former must be minimized through maximum diplomatic effort, including greater U.S. capital participation in the EU project and a renewed Euro-American convergence that prevents a power gap for both the EU and Italy, each operating in a global posture. www.carloplanda.com